So again, we're still in the book Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Almond Wheeler Lauber, PhD. Again, this is Studies in History, Economics and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University. All right, so we talked about the Spanish, a little bit of the Dutch and the Portuguese role in enslaving the American Indians and how they were bringing them over to that side of the world. Because, they've told us all our lives that the Portuguese and Spanish were enslaving Africans. We know they were before they came to America, but once they got here, as we read, they found an abundance of potential slaves over here in America. So now in this video, we will talk about the French's role in enslaving the American Indians as well. So in this book, in chapter 3, we begin, it says, Enslavement by the French. In the French colonies of America, Indian slavery was never authorized by legal declaration during the early colonial period. In fact, the matter received no attention whatever from the home government. Such lack of notice on the part of the monarch was due to the insignificance of American affairs in general, and to the unimportance of the institution of Indian slavery in particular. So they were really didn't care. They didn't have no policies or laws against it or for it. Gradually, however, as the matter began to assume importance in the system of trade through the influence of the trading companies, certain indirect royal action was taken in the 18th century, and this action recognized the existing institution as legal. All right, so it was legal to them eventually to enslave your ancestors. The modifications which the king sought to accomplish in it did not aim to destroy the institution, but rather tended to make it better suited to the requirements of trade. Some doubt appears to have existed regarding the legal status of Indian slaves, and in order to remove it, Jacques Raudot, the intendant at Quebec, decreed in April 1709 that all the Pawnees and Negroes, you see how they put them together? Pawnees and Negroes, who have been bought and who shall be purchased hereafter, shall belong in full proprietorship to those who have purchased them as their slaves. All right, so not just so-called Africans or what they're calling here Negroes, but Pawnees, which is basically the same thing. The state of unrest caused by the Coureurs, the Bois, and others stirring up the tribes in order to take captives for sale to the French as slaves interfered with the success of the trading corporation then in possession of Louisiana. And on October 25, 1720, the Company of the Indies issued a command from Paris stating that such action was contrary to the command of the king and harmful to both the commercial welfare of the company and the establishments which it hoped to make in the territory of the Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas tribes. The Sieur de Bourgmont, in the service of the company in that area, was directed to arrest and confiscate the merchandise of the voyagers who should come to trade within the confines of his jurisdiction without first obtaining permission and declaring to him the motives with which they wished to trade. All right, so before we continue, just wanted to mention what they said about the Coureurs de Bois causing trouble, all right, and basically endangering their company, their business there. All right, these Coureurs de Bois were the so-called fur traders. You see, they talk about in the movie The Revenant and all that. So I just want to read a little bit about them. These were really basically not just fur traders, but they were also slavers. They were enslaving Indians. We're going to read that further on. All right, so now we're in this article written, it says here, from the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. All right, it says, leading the father, the Pawnee homeland, Coureurs de Bois, in the Villas Shore expedition of 1720 by Christopher Steinke, University of New Mexico. All right, and we're going all the way to page 7 of this article, and it's about Coureurs de Bois and the slave trade on the grasslands. All right. After hearing the reports by the Palomas and Cortalejos in 1719, Governor Valverde was reluctant to admit any Pawnee initiative in the attacks on the Apaches. Instead, he blamed enterprising French traders who seemingly could convince the Pawnees to invade New Mexico. Valverde had other reasons to fear a French invasion. France had seized Pensacola and claimed part of Texas following the outbreak of the War of the Quadruple Alliance, which started in 1718. In the same year, the ambitious companies, the Indies, gained control of French Louisiana. Although the company directors were much more interested in trade with New Mexico than war, they sought to open trade route to New Mexico by lining it with French allies, including the Apaches. Yet Indian nations in the eastern plains did not cooperate with this French scheme. French officials shared Valverde's belief that Coureurs de Bois were really the ones behind the Pawnee, Osage, and Wichita attacks on the Apaches. According to the theory, these unregulated traders provoked endless wars in the plains by encouraging Pawnees to raid Apaches for slaves. The slave trade, more than anything else, sabotaged the larger commercial ambitions of the companies, the Indies, by earning the French the continued enmity of the Apaches. All right, so we read in the other book that these Coureurs de Bois were basically instigating fights between the tribes, right? So they can enslave the prisoners, all right, and sell them to their French settlements, colonies, and English settlements. All right, so it's verifying you here that French officials shared Valverde's belief that the Coureurs de Bois were really the ones behind the Pawnee, Osage, and Wichita attacks on the Apaches. All right. On July 23rd, 1745, the Royal Council at Paris sanctioned the possession of Indian slaves by declaring that all slaves who might follow the enemy to the colonies of France and their effects should belong to His Most Christian Majesty. After the acquisition of Canada, the Parliament of Great Britain showed itself favorable to the importation of slaves into the colonies. Accordingly, the 47th article of the Capitulation of September 8, 1760, provided the Negroes and Pawnees of both sexes shall remain in their quality of slaves, Pawnees and Negroes. In the possession of French and Canadians to whom they belong, they shall be at liberty to keep them in their service in the colony or to sell them, and they shall also continue to bring them up in the Roman religion. Roman religion, invasion, conquest. Public opinion in France never concerned itself with the matter of Indian slavery. There appears to have been no opposition to it, either in France or in the French colonies of America. Public opinion early countenanced the institution of slavery in the colonies without distinction of color or race. All right, you hear that, right? These are not just Africans. It was Negro slavery that brought profit to the trader as well as to the colonist. The Indian slave in the French colonies possessed no champion, such as the Indian slave in the Spanish territory had in Las Casas. And they're talking about how Bartolomé de las Casas, as we already heard in the last enslavement videos, how he was trying, they say, right, to help the Indians because he saw so much cruelty that the population was decreasing, genocide, right? So it's saying that in America, and especially in these French territories, there was nobody fighting for the right of these Indians so they wouldn't get enslaved. So it was just crazy. It was going overboard. Basically, nobody was controlling it. All right. Within the French territory under discussion, Negro slavery continued. All right. Negro slavery. They're just talking about you. See that how it says. See why it says Negro, right, and not African. They know not to put African. Without meeting violent opposition, as long as in the territory remained under French control, and with its continued Indian slavery gradually growing weaker as Negro slavery grew stronger, and so less likely to attract attention, much of the French exploration was carried on by the missionaries. Slaveholding was not inconsistent with the belief of these religious travelers. Two objects inspired their zeal: the greater glory of God in the influence and credit of the order of Jesus, or a Jesuit order, right? Of which many of them were members. So a lot of these French, right, were Jesuits, right? We see a trend here, right, with the Spanish and Portuguese as well, right? Jesuits as well. To the missionaries about to start from Paris to explore the Ottawa country, the direction was given. Remember, it is Christ and the cross you are seeking. If you aim at anything else, you will get nothing but affliction for body and mind. The Jesuit held that if the object was good, the action was right. It would redound to the glory of God to convert any heathen, bond or free. Therefore, slave holding by monk was legitimate. All right, again, they were going to enslave you if you were considered a heathen, whether you were bond or free. All right, and making it legal for these Jesuits to basically hold slaves. All right, the chief, though not the earliest source of Indian slaves, so the chief source of Indian slaves among the French was that of captives taken in war with the Indian tribes. For many years after the coming of the French to Louisiana, they and the Natchez Indians lived in friendly intercourse. Minor Indian troubles in 1711 and 1715 resulted in the enslavement and transportation of certain Indians to Cape Francois on the island of Haiti. All right, so where are these Indians? The descendants of these Indians in Haiti. All right, we know who's there. All right, the hostilities begun with the Natchez Indians in 1715 continued intermittently until 1740. In 1730, because of ill treatment by M. du Chappard, governor of Fort Rosalie, who wished the site of a Natchez village on which to build a town, and because of other abuses, the Natchez rose against the French and massacred over 200 of them. All right, so the Natchez weren't having it. They were trying to take their land, everything away from them. Right, so they were not having it, and they killed over 200 of them, it says here. Continuing, Governor Perrier formed an army and advanced against them in their fort. The Natchez offered to leave the place if their lives were spared. So they decided, all right, they're going to kill us, so let's just give them the land and so we can survive. Their offer was accepted, but they were detained as prisoners. So even though they accepted their offer, they still detained them as prisoners. All but 20 who escaped. So all of them became prisoners. We're talking about the whole Natchez Nation Indians, right? Only 20 of them escaped. About 450 of the tribe, including their great son, the little son, and several of the principal war chiefs, were captured and carried to New Orleans. All right, you hear this, right? The women and children were retained as slaves on the plantations. Who? The Natchez, not Africans, were retained as slaves on the plantations. Some of the prisoners were burned in New Orleans. The great son, the little son, their families, and more than 400 of the captives were sent at once to Cape Francois, Haiti, and most of them sold to the planters as slaves. Again, right? The primary families, the chiefs, the war chiefs, the great son and little son, and their families, along with 400 of their captives. We're talking about the Natchez tribal people, were sent to where? Haiti. All right, we know they were sent to the Caribbean. Now we know exactly where. Haiti. So is a lot of the Haitians Natchez people? Yes, they are. All right. Again, once they got there, most of them sold to the planters as slaves. All right. So these are the slaves. These aren't Africans. The two chiefs and their families were retained as prisoners on the island of Haiti, right? On April 22nd, 1731, the minister informed the company that in his opinion, the only solution of the matter lay in selling as slaves the survivors of the two families. They were too much trouble for them. So they said the only solution is selling them as slaves. All right, in Haiti, the Natchez, war chiefs and their families. The registers of the company contain the following record. It was resolved to order the sale of the survivors of the said two families of Natchez Indians. And just to remind everyone that we already had gotten this before in the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. It says here in the bottom, Charleston, South Carolina became a major port for exporting Indian slaves. The Pilgrims and Puritans sold the survivors of the Pickwick War into slavery in Bermuda in 1637, and the French, right? Who are we talking about? The French, right? The French shipped virtually the entire Natchez Nation in chains to the West Indies in 1731. Alright, so we just read on the other book, it was to Haiti. Alright, they sent these people to Haiti. Alright, so let's go back to the other book now. The Natchez War was the most important of those between French and Indians in Louisiana. There were, however, minor difficulties from time to time in which the same policy of enslaving the captive Indians was followed by the French. Alright, so they were enslaving many other tribes and people. The war with the Fox Indians in 1712 serves as an example of these lesser troubles. By 1720, war had broken out between the French and the Chickasaw, whom the English had stirred up. An intermittent warfare with this tribe and others continued in 1724, 1728, 1736, with a peace in 1740, 1750, and 1752. Captives were enslaved by both sides. Some of these were left with the Indians to dispose of at will. Others were kept among the French as slaves. During the period of colonial history, each European nation was in alliance from time to time with various Indian tribes. In time of war with other tribes, the Allied Indians took an active part, and not infrequently they were urged on to hostilities by their white friends for various reasons. One of these reasons was to obtain war captives to give to the whites for sale. Alright, so they were using other Indian allied tribes to capture other Indian tribes so they can be prisoners, right, or slaves to the French. In 1698, Tonti had encouraged the Illinois, who were in alliance with the French, to capture and enslave the Iroquois Indians and so break their power. La Salle favored the same course. In 1708, the Canadian French were exciting the Indians about Kaskaskia to wage war with each other, and were on the spot to get slaves to sell to the English. So they would stir up trouble, make them go to war with each other, and then they would take the captives as prisoners or slaves to sell to the English. So the French were selling American Indians as slaves to the English. These were not Africans. All right. The Marquis de Vaudreuil, Governor General of Canada in 1706, demanded of the Ottawa of Detroit certain captives as slaves for the Allied Sonotuan to replace their men slain by the Ottawa, and others to be slaves to the French in return for a missionary and a French deserter they had killed. So they were even demanding tribes. So some tribes didn't just want to go enslave the other tribes, but they were forced to, right? Once they were defeated, I guess, in war, and in order to replenish the people they had killed, or the French people they had killed, they made this same tribe go get other tribal people, other tribes, as slaves. All right. The slaves were duly presented in 1707. The demands of the Governor General were part of a military plan to form an alliance of the Western tribes with the French, and continued the Indian custom of giving slaves to make reparation for injuries committed or for foes slain. Thus the Allied Indians were satisfied, and a token of subjection was obtained from the Ottawa. As late as 1723, de Vaudreuil was accused of urging on the Abenaki against the Illinois to get slaves for him. All right, so they had so many tribes warring against each other. All right, the main reason was to capture slaves. Apparently, such action was as agreeable to the Indians as to the French. An Indian orator of the Arkansas tribe, in his address given in honor of Bossu's arrival in 1762, said, "We warriors will strike the common enemy. to get prisoners which shall serve as slaves. Sometimes the French went still further and demanded that conquered tribes make war on other tribes. All right, so they would conquer a tribe and then tell them, all right, now that they have control of them, they would make them go to war with other tribes. They would use them as foot soldiers to enslave more American Indians. All right, and they would make them get captives for them to take the place of Frenchmen killed during the war. Such a condition Sieur de Longuevigny placed on the conquered Fox Indians in 1716. Alright, so the Fox Indians were eventually enslaved. As already observed, kidnapping was the means earliest adopted by all European nations for taking Indians as slaves. In 1524, accordingly, Verrazano attempted to capture an Indian family consisting of an old woman, a young girl, and 6 children on the northeast coast of North America. All right, and we got that in the past videos. We also got in this same account, in this same book from 1524 of Verrazano, he clearly states that these same Indians he was trying to kidnap were black, unlike Ethiopians, right? They were dark skinned. They were so-called Negro. All right, Verrazano said this in 1524. All right, but in this story, when he tried to kidnap him, it continues here, says, but the girl proved so intractable that the soldiers were forced to give up the attempt to take the whole family to the ship and finally carried away but one small boy who was too young to make any resistance. That's so messed up. Imagine that could be your son they took. In Cartier's first expedition in 1534, he seized some of the natives and carried them on board his ships. Where? On what? On his ships. We're just talking about Deuteronomy 28. On ships, right? Oh, so the Spanish, Portuguese, and French didn't have ships and they didn't enslave Indians? So this is, again, Jacques Cartier, so-called explorer, slaver in reality, right? And continues, says the relations with the Indians were so friendly that he was able, by gifts and explanations, to persuade them that he meant no harm. So you see the evil nature of these people, right? Tricking your ancestors, being all nice to them, and then grabbing them up and enslaving them. 2 of them were finally detained on board and carried to France. Carried where? To France, to Europe. On the second expedition in 1535, Cartier, replying to the request of the chief Taiguragui that the French carry away another chief, Agona, declared that the King of France had forbidden him to bring back either man or woman, and permitted him to bring to France only 2 or 3 little boys to learn the language. But these pretended instructions did not prevent Cartier from seizing Taiguragui and other chiefs for the purpose of carrying them to France. Chiefs! On the outcry of the Indians against such an act, he promised that the chiefs would be well treated and that after visiting France for the purpose of telling the king about the land of Saguenay, they should be returned to their own country within the space of 12 months. Some of the Indians kidnapped by the explorers mentioned were slaves only in a modified sense. They were not put to servile labor, yet they were deprived of their liberty and were at the disposal of their captors. All right, so is he talking about servitude, like indentured service? Some were held as objects of curiosity. Others were taken for a definite purpose, to furnish information regarding their native country and to serve as interpreters in later expeditions. Again, there we go, interpreters. For such a reason, La Harpe, in 1719, in his journey in the southwest, when returning to the coast, resolved to capture some of the Indians, hoping that by good treatment he might induce them to allow him to settle in their country and to carry out his plans. You see that? All right, trying to be a trickster, right? Set up shop in the town so he can just basically enslave them eventually. Under the pretense of landing to obtain water for his ships, he seized a dozen or more and sailed for Mobile. All right, is that Alabama? So these weren't Africans? No. The Indians soon became suspicious of the explorers and traders, especially in the sections where more than one of the rival races carried on exploration and trade. Such a state of affairs Dutisne found in 1719, when he was badly received by the Pawnee, whom the Osage had told that his purpose was to entrap Indians or slaves. Alright, it says leading the father, the Pawnee homeland, Coureurs de Bois, in the Villas Shore expedition of 1720 by Christopher Steinke, University of New Mexico. The company preoccupation with the slave trade raises questions about its size and relative importance in the 18th century Great Plains. All right, who are these Coureurs de Bois? How big are they? How important were they in the 18th century in the Great Plains in this slave trade? Markets in Louisiana and New Mexico created a demand for slaves that Plain Indians were attempting to satisfy as early as 1706. When Ulubari noted that Apaches and Pawnees were raiding each other to sell captives to the Spaniards and French, respectively, among Indian nations in the eastern plains, only the powerful Osages seemed immune from the retaliatory cycles of slave raiding. Practically no Osage captives appeared in French settlements in the Illinois country. Pawnees were less fortunate. Osage seized so many Pawnee and Wichita captives that they may have adopted a matrilocal household organization from their Caddoan enemies. And traders delivered enough Pawnee slaves to French markets in the Illinois country. Traders. Slave traders. The Pays d'Anhat in Canada, that Pawnees became the French term for any Indian slave originating from the west of the Mississippi. You hear that? It was a general adjective or description, right? It wasn't a certain tribe. Like eventually it became a term for any Indian slave originating from west of the Mississippi, Pawnees. Although many of these slaves were not in fact Pawnees, but Indians from neighboring tribes, about 68% of the Indian slaves in French Canada who received Indian names in the documentation, over 2,000 appear as Pawnees. Alright, but they were from other tribes. The great purpose of the French in the New World was trade. Alright, trade. Alright, but we're starting to realize it was basically slave trade. Not just the word trade like we're thinking, oh, they were trading fur, spices, fruits, whatever. No, it was human cargo, slave trade. All right, they're leaving a word out of this. Their expeditions, excluding those of the missionaries, were commercial in nature. Commercial, key words here. With them, gold hunting was not a primary consideration. They didn't care about gold. Like I told you in the other videos, you are the gold. You are the commodity. You are. In their eyes, you were the slave. As was the case with the Spaniards. All right, so remember, the Spaniards didn't care about gold. They they wanted all this gold. Yeah, they took it, but they were making more prosperous, enslaving you and making you work for free to build their colonies and build their European cities over there. Nor were they seeking a refuge from persecution like the English. The great fur trade was being developed by them. This trade was carried on with the Indians, and in all sections where captives in war or kidnapped Indians were purchased from the natives. Such purchase was usually a part of the trade in furs. The custom of purchasing Indians originated with the early explorers and discoverers purchasing Indians. We ain't talking about Africans being purchased here. Sometimes such a purchase was made for a purely commercial reason, to obtain a slave to perform some certain labor. At other times, the buyer was moved by a humanitarian motive, to save an Indian from torture or death at the hands of his captors. Yeah, sure. The purchased Indian might then be allowed to return to his own tribe and be retained as a slave at the will of his new master. In 1678, Du Lhut, when setting out from Montreal on his travels westward, bought an Indian to act as a guide. Dutisne in 1719 similarly acquired some slaves from a chief at Natchitoches. In 1724, the Bourgmont purchased a considerable number of slaves from the Kansas tribe. Mention is made of 15 at one time, 6 at another. For these he was forced to pay double price, as the Indians stated that year before a Frenchman had given such a price to a party of Illinois who were with them. Sometimes the slaves obtained by these explorers and traders were used in their own expeditions. At other times they were sent back to the settlement along with other merchandise. De Bourgmont sent some of those whom he purchased back to New Orleans. La Vérendrye also in 1731 sent back slaves to French settlements, and in writing of his action implied that he thought he deserved much credit for furnishing the colonies with slaves. Alright, so again, all these slaves, they're not African. The French are enslaving your ancestors. Until well into the latter half of the 18th century, Indian slaves were held by the settlers of Detroit, who obtained them in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. Alright, Indian slaves were held in Detroit. What's Detroit today? Huh? What's it full of? These were not Africans. You are not African. You see the real history, right? It was Indian slaves. These were not African people. You are not a descendant of African. If you're in the Detroit area, if you can trace it back hundreds of years, it was Indian slaves that were being held by the early settlers, all right, who obtained them again in trade with friendly Indians, who in turn took them in war with the Pawnee, Osage, Choctaw, and other western tribes. In 1741, the so-called Nation of the Serpent entirely destroyed 17 villages, killed all the men and older women, made slaves of the young women, and traded them for horses and other merchandise. A report to the home government in 1720 concerning Natchitoches declared that the most extensive commerce which could be carried on with the Indians of that section would be in slaves, horses, skins, etc. Okay, so again, the French were here mainly for trade, and their venture was mainly commercial purposes, and the primary thing helping this was slaves, American Indian slavery, workforce, free labor. Another report sent by Lascelles told of the Alabama Indians bringing 27 or 28 mobile Indian women and children into the colony and disposing of them to the French. All right, so it's unfortunate to hear how the ancestors were enslaving each other. A lot of the times, there was past wars, of course, between them, but also just for survival. They wanted, they're trying to survive, and so that was the only way, really, that the few can really conquer the mass, right? We helped. They had help, and still today, they're getting help. The friendly and allied Indians appreciated the results to be obtained from the sale of their captives to the whites, and not only sold them to the Coureurs de Bois and other traveling traders, but took them directly to the French settlement for sale, as is shown in the preceding paragraph. So can you imagine in these times, this was a big hustle. Like, think about it, man. All right, so you got, I'm like, really think about it, right? So you got these American Indians, right, so-called Negroes, right, with their fur coats on because they were doing fur trade, right? They're chilling, they got money, they're in the trade business, and they're over here selling people, your own people. All right, it's unfortunate again that this happened, but we, what can we learn from this? All right, can we unite now? Right? Apparently, all the leading French settlements afforded a ready market for such slaves. Again, apparently, All the leading French settlements, all right, afforded a ready market for such slaves. All these French colonies, settlements in America were basically taking in American Indian slaves, mostly not Africans. Show us the African records. All right, there is a real history being told here and recorded. Mobile furnishes a case in point. On November 1706, a party of Wa, Wacha, or Waka, Wakanda arrived in the settlement, bringing some Abenaki captives for sale. In the same month, also some Choctaw brought to the settlement Kawita and Altamaha captives for the same purpose. All right, so everybody was in the game. That was the game at the time. Everybody, whether it was for survival or whatever, but a lot of the tribes were doing it to each other. All right, and it's interesting this tribal name Kawita because we got a town in our indigenous region called Talamanca in Costa Rica called Kawita. And Altamaha sounds almost Peruvian. Continuing with Indian slavery in colonial times, we're in chapter 3, the French, role in slavery. Continues, says it was the Jesuit and French missionaries who first advocated the purchase of Indian captives by the traders in order to prevent their being put to death. By putting them in a mild condition of servitude, they hoped to place them in a position where they would be Christianized. Again, servitude. Both Tonti and Lascelles advised such a course of action. The colonists favored the same action for a more commercial reason. The French of Kaskaskia in 1708 were urging the Allied Indians to war and were on the spot to obtain captives to sell as slaves to the English. De Vaudreuil, Governor General of Canada, throughout the first quarter of the 18th century was urging the Abenaki to wage war on the Illinois to obtain slaves for him. An important factor in the French colonial trade was the Coureurs de Bois. These men, having cut loose from civilization, wandered at will among the Indians, trading for the various commodities which they could dispose of in the settlements of either the French or English colonies. All right, so they say trade, we got to have the, open quotes, close quotes, trade, right? They were basically slavers, most of them. That was the real hustle. That was the real, like in today, that would be the money. All right. One of these commodities was Indian slaves. Okay. One of these commodities is the major commodity. You are the gold, obtained for the most part from the tribes who had captured them in war. Judging from the number of these white men of the woods, their unrestrained life, and the evidence given by the men of the time, it seems not unlikely that this feature of colonial trade produced a considerable portion of Indian slaves used by the French. If the Coureurs de Bois did not find a sufficient number of slaves among the tribes they visited, they not infrequently stirred up the tribes to war so that they might obtain the captives for sale. You see what they were doing? So there's a group of people, their main job was to go get slaves, and when they couldn't find any, they or anybody was in war, and they would create wars. All right, they will create the problem, then they will bring their solution, which was to enslave you. All right, you, not Africans, you. On July 25th, 1707, Lascelles wrote from Fort Louis to the Minister of Marine that the Coureurs de Bois from Canada were thus stirring up the Indian tribes against each other in order to obtain Indian slaves to sell in Louisiana. The work of the Coureurs de Bois was, however, by no means limited to Louisiana, but extended over all the area claimed by the French. So they're saying Coureurs de Bois. Now, how many people is this? Who were they? This is a really I mean, this is a really general description of obviously more than one person. We're talking about a large group of people doing this all over the area claimed by the French, which was pretty huge. We know that, right? The desire of the English for Indian slaves afforded an opportunity for profit that could not be rejected. All right, so English plantations, right? And they were getting them from these Coureurs de Bois, French, Europeans, and also other American Indian traders, right? Again, none of these were African. They always found a ready market for their Indian slaves with the English of the Carolina country. The control of the French officials over this wandering class was always slight, and since there was practically no export trade in Indians to be had in Louisiana, and since all the Indians whom they obtained could not be disposed of in the colony, they turned to the English colonies for the purpose. The English what? Plantation. They definitely needed slaves in these plantations, right? Right? Cotton, sugar plantations. We know the stories, right? Of slavery. Where were they getting their supply? Their workforce? From American Indian slaves. All right? Let's wake up. Some effort was made by the French officials to prevent this trade, but the attempt met with indifferent success. They didn't stop this. It was a successful business, commerce going on, enslaving your ancestors to the plantations. It was not the traffic in human beings which disturbed them, but the fact that their enemy, the English, were profiting by transaction. So they didn't care about you getting enslaved because they were doing it. They were taking advantage of that. They just cared that their rivals, the English, wouldn't get, too powerful in that region, have too much success. That's what they were worried about. They didn't care about you. In 1714, a report of Cadillac to the home government lamented both his inability to restrain the French allied Indians from trading with the English in slaves and other commodities, and also his embarrassment at not being able to prevent the French colonists from trading with the English in skins and Indian slaves. You hear all this, right? Real history. Such opposition, however, was not general among the French colonial officials. Some of the most prominent ones were engaged in this same slave trade with the English. Again, these French colonial officials, the most prominent ones, were actually engaged in this same slave trade, the American Indian slave trade. With who? With the English. Both of them enslaving American Indians. They're not getting them from Africa. And when appearing to be opposed to it, in 1708, Bienville ordered the Canadian French to cease exciting the Indians of Kaskaskia to wage war on each other to obtain slaves for them. Yet in the same year he proposed, since the French would not cultivate the land, to obtain the needful supply of labor by seizing Indians and sending them to the West Indies in exchange for Negroes or other American Indians. Keyword, they say Negroes, right? They don't say Africans. And in his report to the home government, mentioned above, Cadillac complained of the selling of Indian slaves to the English by Bienville. Such transactions by the French officials were carried on secretly. The slave trade had evidently become enough of a problem in the plains by the late 1710s that French officials identified it as their primary obstacle to commercial and political expansion. In 1717, François de Lemarie, a priest who had served for nearly a decade in the settlement of Mobile, composed a memoir on Louisiana in which he recommended that the French crown outlaw the Indian slave trade in the Great Plains. It was so major, it was affecting so much what was going on, right? They wanted to control it, really. That's what they really wanted to do, right? So they wanted to outlaw it supposedly because it was so major, right? Indian slave trade was, this is not Africans. Again, Indian slave trade. He specifically condemned those coureurs de bois, the coureurs de bois, like Pudret, who bought and sold slaves of Paducas and other peoples of the Missouri. A ban on the slave trade would, he concluded, cut at the root the wars that the Indians only continue between themselves because of the advantageous sale that they make of their captives to the traders, who then resell them in this colony to the Spanish and to the vessels that come to our port for selling them a third time to the islands. All right, who were they giving the Spanish, and who was going to these islands in the West Indies? American Indians, not Africans. All right, there was a whole circle of slave trade, right? We're starting to see, right? Is it starting to add up to you? The directors of the Compagnie des Indes, monitoring their unprofitable colony from Paris and hoping to open the New Mexico trade through the Paducas, eventually heeded Le Marier's call for a ban on the slave trade. All right, so remember in the other book we read the ban, right? But it didn't have no effect, really. Let's see what it says here. In late October 1720, they ordered Governor Bienville to end the Indian slave trade. Bienville, right? We got him on the other book, right? Along the Missouri and Arkansas rivers, because the raiding for captives inhibited trade across the plains. They complained that voyagers were fomenting war between Indian nations in order to procure slaves. All right? They were instigating wars. This was not only contrary to the orders of the king, but very harmful to the well-being of the company's commerce. The directors concluded, but officials in Louisiana largely opposed this plan. In the Illinois country, Bois Bryant worried that a ban on the Apache slave trade would alienate Pawnees with cheetahs and Osages, and that the Pawnees would continue raiding and simply sell their captives to Fox people, who could destroy the Illinois country. He concluded that the French were stuck between two options: a dangerous Pawnee-Fox alliance or an alliance with Pawnees against Apaches, who would then block trade with New Mexico. While the director of the Compagnie des Indes believed that an end to the slave trade would secure peace in the plains, they overestimated the influence of slave trading coureurs de bois. They overestimated the influence of slave trading coureurs de bois on Pawnee chiefs. Pawnees were not raiding Cortalejo and Paloma Apaches simply to meet a demand for slaves. Instead, these Apaches occupied lands that Pawnees wanted to use for themselves, bison ranges and river valleys in the western plains. So here's slavery in Canada, New France. Slavery in Canada was practiced by many of the indigenous populations and predates the arrival of Europeans to the continent. However, it was not until the colonization and commencement of trade with England's southern colonies that commercial chattel slavery became commonplace in New France. The institution, which endured for almost 2 centuries, 200 years, we're talking about enslaving American Indians, affected thousands of men, women, and children descended from indigenous and African people. See, they told you indigenous because in the historic records, they clearly tell you that Canada had as slaves indigenous people, not Africans or so-called Negroes. All right, they're gonna throw African here. That's the hijack. They just mean other Indians from, with darker complexions. It says here, French indigenous patterns of enslavement. Clearly established prior to the French arrival, a system of slavery was well underway. The French practice of slavery therefore existed more as an adaptation to an existing system rather than the opposition of a new system upon indigenous peoples and spaces. Slavery was adopted by French settlers in earnest beginnings in 1632, continuing into Anglo-Canadian occupation in the 18th century. Initially, slavery in the colony was complicated by France's ethical stance on the matter. Slave ownership in New France was not legally recognized as per their free soil doctrine, but it could still be justified with the understanding that only the act of enslaving people was deemed unethical and simply buying or receiving slaves was accepted. Hoping to mimic the economic success of other colonies, France's royal administration gave in to Canadian pressure from slave purchasing colonial officials and issued the Roudout Ordinance of 1709, putting into law a legitimacy of enslavement within St. Lawrence Valley colonial setting. French settlers primarily acquired slaves through the process of ritualized gift giving. All right, ritual they did. Gift giving, they tricked you. Trick or treat, commonly used to facilitate diplomatic negotiations. However, French hunger for more slaves altered indigenous practices of captive taking and enslavement. Warfare focusing on captive taken increased as captives became not just a way to symbolically replace lost relatives, but also became economically valuable goods to exchange with the French. Networks of alliances between indigenous groups helped funnel captives towards the French. The exchange of slaves and different understandings about the nature of slavery also had real impacts on French relationships with their native neighbors. Protracted conflicts such as the Fox Wars were largely encouraged because war captives provided an ample source of new slaves. Indigenous nations allied to the French and antagonistic to the Fox used this incentive to leverage French military support. At other times, different conceptions of slavery stood in the way of relationships. Denonville's decision to send 40 captured Iroquois to France as galley slaves proved to be a major roadblock to future peace negotiations between the French and the Iroquois. Similarly, diplomatic talks with Sioux chiefs in 1742 were marred by the presence of Sioux slaves who had ended up in French possession. Sioux slaves, okay, not Africans. Now we're going to dodge the hijack on this part, but we're going to see something interesting. It says African slave trade in New France, right? So-called African American, right? So-called Negro, it's just you they're talking about. It says African slaves in New France were a minority. You were a minority in France, African slaves. So who was the majority? Because they were calling these people Negroes, right? It was American Indians. In relationship to both African slaves within New France and throughout all the New World slaveholdings. Out of the roughly 3.8 million slaves who had been transported from Western Africa to Americas by the 1750s, toss your own hijack, only about 1,400 ended up in New France. Only 1,400 ended in New France, Canada. Only 1,400? What happened to the millions? Similarly, African slaves, touch the hijack, were continuously outnumbered by the enslaved indigenous population. They were outnumbered by the enslaved indigenous population that formed the majority of the forced labor force in New France. All right? Go look it up, slaves and their owners in Le Royal, 1730, 1760. And we have that. I have it. All right, but it just says the same exact thing, that the majority of slaves in Canada in the 1700s was indigenous people, not Africans. All those slaves up there working in their plantations and their farms and their servants or whatever, these were indigenous people. Slavery on Ile Royale. We read this in the other book. The Louisbourg in the colony of Ile Royale, Cape Breton and Prince Edward Island is one city of New France with official records of black slave community. Louisbourg was an important trading port for the colony because of its key geographical location. It was midpoint between Europe and France's Caribbean colonies and was not so subject to sea ice. As the settlements to the west, its economy depended on fishing, the military, and trade. It is believed that hundreds of black slaves traveled through the port aboard merchant vessel, black, crayon color. Only 216 black individuals, nevertheless, were actually enslaved on Ile Royale. All right, so you see that their stories, they're telling you their stories that hundreds of black slaves went through there on merchant ships, right? But actually, only 216 are recorded. All right, and that's in this source, slaves and their owners in Ile Royale, 1713 to 1760. Look it up. Nevertheless, were actually enslaved on Ile Royale. The majority of these slaves were the property of the wealthiest individuals of Ile Royale, merchants, government, and military officials. Owning slaves increased one's living condition and social status within the colony. We already know these were American Indians they had, these wealthy people, individuals. Some opposition to the trade was shown by the Jesuits, since the hope for result of having numbers of slaves to convert, if purchased by the French, did not materialize. Accordingly, in 1693, they petitioned the governor of Canada to prohibit the trade in Indian slaves. The request was granted in an order issued to that effect, but without definite result. The Coureurs, the Bois, continued the trade in spite of the penalty of fine and imprisonment. It didn't do anything to change the outcome. The American Indian slavery continued hundreds of years. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Again, we're in chapter 3 and we're talking about the French's involvement in enslaving the American Indians. It says here the Indians realized that the trade in captive slaves was profitable. It was profitable to you. You were a hustler, right? So you helped. When in 1724 the Kansas tribe charged the Bourgmont double price for slaves sold him, they feared that he would be angry at the price asked, and that in consequence they would lose future trade. So they presented him with 5 slaves as a gift. Throughout history, the children of slave mothers have generally been considered slaves. A report on the condition of Louisiana, 1716, declared that the inhabitants were accustomed to sell the children of their Indian female slaves. Later in 1724, a royal decree provided that children born of marriages between slaves should be slaves and should belong to the masters of their mothers, and not to the masters of their fathers. If father and mother should belong to different masters. The uses to which Indian slaves were put, either in early or later colonial times, were determined by economic conditions. Among the explorers, the need for guides and interpreters was imperative, and one finds the French, like the Spanish, using Indian slaves for this purpose. On his second expedition, Cartier made such use of the Indian children whom he carried to France on his first expedition. So he brought them back now that they spoke French. All right. Laudonnière in 1564 intended to use slaves for this purpose. All right. So we're talking about 1500s French over here in America, right? Enslaving. When did the so-called transatlantic slave trades begin? Man, how much accounts do we need from the 1500s of your ancestors getting enslaved? All right, this is part 3 of the enslavement subject, right? Series. Early in the 18th century, life among the French of Louisiana, both rich and poor, was quite licentious. And one of the means of fostering this life was the use of Indian women, slave and free. The demoralization resulting from such a condition attracted attention, and in 1709 it was urged that girls suitable for wives be sent over in order to prevent these disorders and debaucheries. Agricultural pursuits appear to have been the chief labor to which the French put Indian slaves. Such pursuits, all right, again, agricultural pursuits, plantations, right, growing stuff. We know who's doing that, right? Such pursuits, along with trading, formed the chief industry of the colonies, but it was the general tendency of the French to prefer the novelty and excitement of the trader's life, rather than more quiet existence of the agriculturalist. So they'd rather be hustling, right? They don't want to move. They don't want to be like they're growing food and all that. Depending on that, they like the whole slave trade thing, right? Trader's life, they call it. Bienville complained much of this state of affairs and sought to remedy it. The consequence of this tendency was to make the price of labor high, and the use of Indian slaves was a means at hand to solve the difficulty. Indian slaves. In the simpler life of the inhabitants of the Illinois country, agriculture was the chief industry of the settlers until the close of the period under discussion, and the farmers increased the results of their industry by the extensive use of Indian slaves. All right, not African slave, Indians slaves. Throughout the French territory, in the military stations, both soldiers and frontiersmen found use for their Indian women slaves as cooks and in performing the other domestic labors of fort and camp. The male slaves were used in erecting fortifications. You build their towers, You build their municipalities, their government buildings, their town halls, their city halls. You build it, performing other heavy labor and as guides in military expeditions. The custom of using Indian slaves as a bribe or reward was common. In either case, the purpose of the whites was the same: to procure the friendship and alliance of the tribes. In the Northwest, the French demanded that certain subdued tribes bring them Indian slaves, which they might use to replace the members of the allied tribes whom the conquered tribes had killed during the war. In the area where the claims of the European nations overlapped, alliance of the tribes was especially desired by each nation. These Indian captive slaves, or slaves purchased from other tribes, were often returned to their own tribes as a peace offering or as a token of friendship. All right, so they would play these games, right? Thus, the alliance of the tribes was won, and a barrier created against the encroachments of the Spanish and the English. In 1728, the King of France issued an edict regarding certain concessions of land and required a tax of 5 livres on each slave, the proceeds of which were to be used in building churches and hospitals. Churches. Thus, the Indian slaves, along with the Negroes, served as a property basis in this one instance. So that when they say Negroes, they're talking about other American Indians, usually coming in from other parts of America, like the Caribbean, Central America, or South America, or even the Western North America, like California, right? Served as a property basis in this one instance. As they did many times in English colonies, they were also regarded as property in all legal and business transactions and were classed along with Negroes, right? So you see, they're not saying Africans. How far have we read along so far? And they keep saying Negroes, right? They're not saying anything about Africans. Domestic animals and real estate which could be sold to satisfy their owner's debt. The early slavery among the French was mild in nature. The relation of the French and the Indians, bond or free, was always different from that existing between the English and the Indians. The Frenchmen never looked upon the Indians with the disdain and contempt for an inferior race which was displayed by the English. Well, not all of them, right? Marriage between French and Indians was common. All right, so marriage between French and Indians, all right? So not Africans, slaves, right? Because when we know about what they start saying, mulattoes, right? And how, these French colonies, the French were marrying with the slave girls who are supposed to be, right, African descendants, but they were really marrying so-called Negro girls, right? But they were Indians. So marriage between French and Indians was common. The social result of these close connections was more pronounced in case of the Frenchman than in that of the Indian. It meant that Indianizing of the Frenchman, or the bringing him to the social level and to the life and habits of the red man. He took on your ways, copper-colored tribe. The most striking result of this tendency was supplied by the courier, Du Bois, but the same result was apparent even in the case of the superior colonists of Lower Louisiana. And to this result, the Indian slave contributed in a measure. The lack of social distinction between Frenchman and native tended toward kind treatment on the part of the owner, into a shifting of the social planes of master and slave toward that of equality. Yet instances of cruelty to slaves are not lacking. All right, so just because some of them were doing it, or most of them were marrying, or whatever, cruelty to slaves was not lacking. The punishment of the age were cruel, whether the offender was bond or free. It has been said that the dominating feature of French colonial life was trade, but religious and commercial advancement went hand in hand. From the earliest arrival of the French, the missionary labors of the church extended not only to the Indian tribes, but also to the Negro and Indian slaves held by the colonists. The conversion of the Indian was an asset for the growth of trade. It was an asset to make you Christian. For the growth of what? Trade. What? Slave trade. French commissions, as well as Spanish, provided for the conversion of the Indians. Priests and friars were everywhere present. Each Christianized Indian slave marked a gain in the advancement of the faith. It made possible a readier access to trade with the convert's tribe and those of his friends. But the religious training and teaching of slaves were not entirely a matter of policy. All right? It was rather a part of the generally kind treatment of the master. The rights of the church were commonly accorded them. The Louisiana church records certain accounts of the birth, baptism, marriage, and burial of Indian slaves. All right, not African slaves. The Mobile and New Orleans registers are similar to the church registers to be found throughout Lower Canada, wherever a church was established. All right, so all these places, the records, the registers, similar, right? It was Indian slaves, Indians registered. The parish registers of Levi's, Quebec, and Long Point are cases in point. All right, all these places. The first church established, you can see, was all Indians. You, so-called Negro. Throughout the first and part of the second half of the 18th century, these registers show that Indian slaves, many of whom in Quebec, for instance, were brought from Louisiana, were baptized, and then records kept of such baptisms as in the case of the whites. The church records of Kaskaskia and Vicines make frequent mention of the birth, baptism, and death of Indian slaves called Pawnees, down to the time of British occupation, but from that time they became more and more infrequent as Indian slavery gradually gave way to Negro slavery. You know, they just switched your name. They started calling you more Negro, but it's still the same people. The baptismal register of Mobile, Alabama, dating from 1704 to 1740, contains baptismal records of whites, blacks, and Indians. The laws of France did not permit the holding of any Christian in slavery. This meant that the conversion of Indians or other slaves would confer freedom upon them. All right, so you hear that? So there was a little benefit, right, to letting them say or telling them, yeah, okay, I'll be Christian. All right, yes, I'll Christian. So you can win your freedom, so you wouldn't get enslaved and sent to a plantation. All right, and we got this in the other parts, right? When we're looking at the census records, right? How they were suing these people, right? In the Code Noir of 1724, Louis XV commanded that all slaves in the French colonies be educated in the apostolic Roman Catholic religion and be baptized, and enjoined their owners to have these matters attended to within a reasonable time. The code dealt directly with Negro slaves, but the Indian slaves still in existence were necessarily included in its provisions. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. We're in Chapter 3, the French involvement in American Indian slavery. It says here, in Louisiana, Indian slavery began with the founding of the colony. All right, they founded the Louisiana colony with what? Indian slavery. A report of the colony written in 1704 states that a Fort Louis de Louisiane, having a white population of 180 soldiers, and 27 French families, numbering 64 persons, a total of 244 white persons. There were 6 Indian boy slaves from 12 to 18 years of age and 5 Indian girl slaves from 15 to 20 years of age. In 1708, the colony consisted of 14 officers, 76 soldiers, 13 sailors, 3 priests, 6 mechanics, 1 Indian interpreter, 24 laborers, 28 women, 25 children, a total of 190 free persons, and 80 Indian slaves. In 1713, besides the soldiers, there were 28 families, 20 Negroes, and a few Indian women and children. In the northern part of the Mississippi Valley, also Indian slavery began with the coming of the whites. Slavery at Vincennes and in the country below the present site of Terre Haute, Indiana, was regulated by the laws of Louisiana. That in the country to the north was regulated by the customs of Canada. Indian slavery in Canada began early. Record exists of Indian slaves in Montreal in 1670. In Louisiana, the greater number of slaves were Negroes, that's you, American Indians, whereas in Canada, the larger portion were Indians, same people. But Alisa's telling you that in Canada, what? The larger portion were Indians, not Africans. In the early history of Vincennes, most of the slaves were Indians. For the inhabitants were more extensively engaged in the Indian trade than in agricultural pursuits. The same was true of the country about Detroit. Again, Indian slaves, right? Mostly Indian slaves in Detroit, not Africans. Some of these Indians went, of course, to Louisiana, but the larger portion went to Canada. A report in 1750 shows that in the 5 French villages of the Illinois country, there were 1,100 whites, 300 blacks, and 60 Indian slaves. Blacks touched the hijack. Indian slavery, already given way to Negro slavery, continued so to do after British occupation. Indian slaves, mostly children, are recorded in Detroit in 1710, 1712, and 1715. Their use continued there until the English occupation. Indian slave children. A report in 1733 shows that the Canadians trading in Indian slaves whom they seized or purchased from other Indians. By the terms of the Surrender of Montreal, 1760, already mentioned, the English guaranteed to these settlers all the rights and property they had enjoyed in Article 4 of the capitulation, provided that all Negro and Pawnee slaves should remain in their condition of servitude. In 1763, the population of Canada comprised about 70,000 Europeans, 30,000 Indians, and 400 black slaves. Touch the hijack. It will be seen that the number of Negro slaves was very small as compared with the number in Louisiana, and judging from the frequent mention of Indian slaves in the parish records, and the not inconsiderable trade in such slaves that went on with the western tribes, one may concede the truth of the assertion that the number of Indian slaves in that territory under Canadian law exceeded the number of Negro slaves, even though in proportion to the white population the number was small. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Chapter 3 says here several causes contributed to the passing of Indian slavery in French territory. Wherever the American Indians have been brought into contact with the white races, the result has been disaster to the red men. The Indian's nature is not adapted to the white man's scheme of life, their schemes. The Indian absorbed the white man's diseases and vices, their bad behavior. Not the least of these vices was the love for strong drink, and the weakness of the natives in this respect was recognized and encouraged by the traders of all nations. That's why they say fire, water, and the Indian don't mix, right? The decrease in game and other food supplies as the Indians retreated from the sea, famine followed by gluttonous excesses, wasting of the forests of the tablelands, all resulted in inferior living conditions and a consequent decrease in the birth rate and weakening of the tribes. As the weakened tribes withdrew from contact with the whites, they usually joined with strong tribes. So that sounds to me like curses. The removal of tribes from their immediate neighborhood, removal from your own place, taken somewhere else, and the union with other and distant tribes acted as a check on the whites obtaining Indians as slaves. Such was the case with the tribes from whom the French of the Illinois country and Canada drew their slaves. It has already been seen that the French missionaries of early colonial days believed that the enslavement of Indians would serve as means of spreading the Christian religion. They found, however, that the method of obtaining Indian slaves by trade only increased the distribution of spirituous liquors among the tribes. And so in 1693 they asked the king to prohibit the Indian slave trade. An order to this effect was accordingly issued, but with little result. The Coureurs de Bois found means to carry on the trade. clandestine notwithstanding the penalty attached. Again in 1736, the king decided formally to prohibit the enslavement of Indians and issued a decree to that effect, but to no advantage. The gradual passing out of existence of Indian slavery, furthermore, was due in no small measure to its unsatisfactory character. The leading colonists early made up their minds to this effect. Bienville, in a letter to Minister of Marine, July 28, 1706, stated that the French colonists earnestly requested Negroes to till their lands, for whom they were willing to pay silver, since the colonists found Indian slaves unsatisfactory. He furthermore requested permission for the colonists to transport Indian slaves to the West Indian Islands, to the Caribbean, in exchange for Negroes, exchange for other American Indians. The fact that the colonists were willing to trade 3 Indians for 2 Negroes is sufficient proof of the small value of Indians as slaves. Indian slaves were prone to run away, and their use by the French as individual laborers, or their use only in small groups, if worked together, made escape comparatively easy. A letter of Perrier to the home government, May 12, 1728, declared that the traffic in Indian slaves and their use in the French colony was contrary to the welfare of the country, since such slaves served but a short time before they escaped back to their own tribes or to neighboring Indians. So now this is perfect example of what was going on. So when they were saying they were exchanging these unsatisfactory Indians for Negroes, they didn't mean because they couldn't work or they were weaker or whatever they say to us, It's because they were escaping, rebelling, they were hard to maintain and control. So they would, send them, to foreign lands in exchange for other people from foreign lands, so they wouldn't know the country and they wouldn't know the people, so they wouldn't try to escape. That's the major plan. That's what they were doing. Moreover, these deserting Indians persuaded the Negro slaves to run away with them. Run away, let's run away together. So dodge the hijack, because it's the same people. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Again, we're in chapter 3, almost done here, in the French involvement in the enslavement of the American Indian. Continuing, it says, among the slaves, the boys were not so much to be depended upon as the girls. So again, they're talking about American Indians. Since they were stubborn, resented more strongly their being held in slavery, and were more inclined to run away. So they preferred the girls because the boys would run away more. Long's Journal, 1768, 1782, speaking of the Western Indians records, they are also full of pride and resentment, and will not hesitate to kill their masters in order to gratify their revenge for a supposed injury. The girls are more docile and assimilate much sooner into the manners of civilization. It is probable that slaves coming from the Pawnee tribe and held so largely by the French of Detroit and Canada were more satisfactory than those coming from other tribes. It has been said that it would be difficult to find another of the wild tribes of the continent capable of subjection to domestic slavery. But the Pawnee, like other slaves, ran away. Not Africans. Though Indian slaves were not as profitable laborers as might be desired, their loss was to be avoided if possible. The matter was so serious as to interest the action of the authorities, and in 1709, Jacques Radour, intendant of Canada, issued an ordinance containing an injunction which forbade any slave running away, and containing provisions for imposing a fine of 50 livres on those who aided such runaways. Indian slaves were too few in number and too inferior in capacity for labor to supply the needs of the colonists. So an attempt was made by the home government to supply the needed laborers by establishing the system of indentured servants in the colonies. Indentured servants. On November 16, 1716, an ordinance directed that vessels leaving France for any of the king's American colonies were to carry thither, if of 50 tons, 3 servants, of 60 to 100 tons, 4 servants, of 100 tons and upwards, 6 servants. The period of service of such servants was fixed at 3 years. They were required to be of sound body, between the ages of 18 and 40, and in height not under 4 feet. These servants were to be examined before the officers of the Admiralty to see if they fulfilled the requirements of the law, and were to receive another examination by the commissary on landing in America. All right, so I hope you're understanding. They're sending French people as slaves, or let's say indentured servants. All right, French people along, they would come here and work along with the so-called American Indian or so-called Negro, right? You. All right, so in the same place, they would both be servants or indentured servitude or whatever you want to call them, slaves. All right, and that's what they're talking about. All right, so continue, says, the purpose of France in making such careful provisions for sending indentured servants to the New World was a real effort to increase the population and therefore the trade of America. Again, increase the population. What population? Their population. Their people, their nation, their race. Is that what they're talking about? Moreover, the home government feared the danger that might come to the colony by the increase of the black, so-called black, you, the American Indian, you increasing your, because they were enslaving you, right, over the white population, and hoped this indentured servant system would be a means to that end. So they weren't just bringing white, white, so-called white indentured servants over because they needed servitude. They could have got that from the Indians, but they wanted to increase the white population, make sure the Indian slavery population wouldn't increase, or so-called black. The colonists preferred black slaves to white servants. Their term of service was for life instead of a short period. That's the only difference. They were easier to control, cheaper to keep, and were better workers. Yet it has been estimated that from 1711 to 1728, 2,500 redemptioners were brought to the French colonies. All right, such a number of white servants must in a measure have checked the acquisition of Indian slaves. But the need for laborers was to be supplied in the French colonies by the black, so-called black. Black is you they're talking about. They ain't talking about crayon colors. They're talking about the copper color races of America instead of the white race. Although the home government grew to fear the result of the rapid increase of the Negro element. Negro, they're all kind of tags for you. Talking about you, the American Indian element. Yet at first it favored the importation of blacks to the American colonies. So dodge the hijack. Other American Indians, remember. Indian slavery in colonial times within the present limits of the United States. Again, we're almost done in chapter 3. The French involvement in the enslavement of the American Indians. And it says here to open up and work the mineral resources of Louisiana. Philip Francois Renaud was sent out by the Company of the West in 1719. On his way, he bought at San Domingo, or we're talking about Santo Domingo, right, in Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, in the name of his company, 500 Negroes for work in the mines. So he went to Santo Domingo, right? He didn't go to Africa. He went to Santo Domingo, he captured, and he bought, 500 Negroes, not Africans, people of dark skin complexion. We already know what that is, right? Other American Indians, dodge the hijack, for working on these mines. Where? In Louisiana. So these were not Africans coming in there. These Negroes were taken into the Illinois country. The number of Negroes in the Illinois country never equaled that of the country farther south. Yet in 1750, a Jesuit missionary found 1,100 whites, 300 blacks, and 60 Indian slaves in 5 villages of the Illinois country. And by 1763, the black population numbered over 900. From the foregoing account, it will be seen that the steadily increasing number of Negro slaves resulting from a promotion of the commercial interests of the home government and from the more satisfactory labor performed by the blacks must have been the leading cause that produced a steady decrease in the number of Indian slaves among the French. So dodge the hijack, because it's all the same people. All right, different tribes, different peoples, different parts of America. And that's the end of chapter 3 and part 1 of this book. And we're going to get into definitely in the next parts of this subject, next videos, into this part 2, the institution as practiced by the English. Now we're going to talk about the English role in all this slavery of the American Indians? Who were they really enslaving? Africans or your ancestors, your true ancestors, American indigenous people? Again, this was Indian Slavery in Colonial Times Within the Present Limits of the United States by Alman Wheeler Lauber. All right, Studies in the History, Economics, and Public Law, edited by the Faculty of Political Science of Columbia University.